Literally every video I've seen and am in part at least responsible for by way of this channel regarding what Zelda fans want to see in the sequel of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild can be summed up by saying,
Breath of the Wild is great and everything, but I missed a lot of stuff from the older Zelda games, so just make that game again, but bring all that older stuff back.
And like, that's fair, but I disagree entirely with the idea that the only way to make the sequel of Breath of the Wild better is to bring back traditions and conventions that the developers behind this game very intentionally went out of their way to go against. Let's talk about it. Those of you that have been joining me on twitch.tv/fanatixfour, linked in the description. New streams every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern time. Follow us over there and me on Twitter for updates on any additional streams or changes to that schedule. Know that I recently started a new playthrough of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. My intent originally was to only play during those Twitch streams because while I have been wanting to revisit Breath of the Wild for some time now, I always found myself losing interest in dropping those attempted playthroughs in favor of doing something else. Smash, usually dropping the playthrough for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I thought that was in large part due to me feeling like I could see the seams in the experience, and because of that, while it's a fantastic game, it was a fantastic game that had served its purpose and was no longer new or mysterious enough for me to enjoy. But when thinking about good games to stream, and after seeing our friend Ian mess around on stream with the game on his Twitch channel, I realized that streaming it for me could be an easy way to change that by inherently changing the way I'd approach playing it due to now having an audience of people watch me play it. And in doing so, I realized something. I never actually saw through any seams. I just made those up in my head. What I mean by that is when I started my older failed playthroughs, I was doing what I think a lot of people do with this and honestly any game, playing it like a typical relatively linear experience where my progression through it was led by what I was supposed to do. That alone sucked the enjoyment I had with the game originally right out of the subsequent playthroughs. Obviously, in my initial playthrough, I didn't play the game the way I was supposed to because I was playing blind, so playing it that way wasn't even really possible. Fast forward to now, after deciding that I would casually do the non-story or campaign-specific tasks while filling out the map and completing the basic minor test of strength shrines for fun off stream and falling in love with the game all over again in the process, I've realized that even though the possibility to play the game the more linear way exists now, there's no reason I have to play any differently than the way I did way back when it initially released. Adding a more heavy-handed narrative that strives to make it feel more epic, manufactured, temples that make the game arbitrarily varied, clashing with the world in the process, or solutions for hand-holding in a world that on some level is meant to make you uncomfortable and keep you on your toes. Weapon durability, weather, stamina, etc., etc. are all things people have been begging for in the follow-up to this game. In my opinion, that would guarantee the sequel a distant second place spot relative to the original Breath of the Wild. Rather than doing any of that, I want the sequel to embrace this approach to wonder, experimentation, and freedom. Here's a few ideas I have on how it can. First, the game's world should play a bigger role in the campaign, passively of course. In the original Breath of the Wild, the world of Hyrule plays a major part in facilitating the experience on a gameplay level, but it only really has a role in the campaign on a narrative level by way of the memories you collect to unlock the flashback cutscenes and complete the memories quest, which is a start, but isn't good enough. Don't get me wrong, I'm not asking for more fetch quests or anything like that, but I do think there should be some way for the game to reward you for exploring it in more ways that impact the outcome of the game in the same way that defeating the Divine Beast or finding all the memories have an impact on the ending of the original game. Maybe that means some sort of additional content for discoveries you log in your compendium, which should only be a positive thing, like rewarding players that have seen less with some sort of guidance guidance on finding more, like maybe having animals and other creatures emerge from a recognizable spot on the map and a cutscene as a hint to where to find them if you haven't already. And for people that have made more progress on their compendium, give a different but not necessarily better clip. Reward exploration without punishing players that don't want to play that way, which admittedly is a tricky balance. The next thing would be to, rather than getting rid of shrines like I've seen many people suggest in videos like this, would be to further integrate them into the core of the experience. Currently, shrines have big Portal vibes going throughout, and that's great, but I think taking an approach similar to The Witness would make them even more special in the sequel. They should continue to function in the way the first 4 shrines do, by presenting challenges that naturally teach the player how to solve future puzzles and overcome harder, more complex versions of the same concept later on. To elaborate on this The Witness comparison, puzzle solving should be a form of language that rewards the players that solve them by arming them with knowledge that in some way helps them solve future puzzles. The only place I'd veer away from the Witness approach would be to, instead of teaching the player that correct answers rhyme in a sense, the initial problems can rhyme, but the answer ultimately remains open-ended. In the original Breath of the Wild, this is sort of done, but the approach was incomplete. While shrines teach the player about things like drafts of wind and how they interact with Boy Zelda objects and other elements in the world, or the circuitry shrines that have you use electricity and things that are conducive to it as a means to solve puzzles. They neglected to do the same with the unique aspects of the Divine Beast, being that they are all a canvas that you need to manipulate to get solutions for each problem they present. The only thing that can teach you that is the Divine Beasts themselves. I think the shrines in the future should be better integrated so that this isn't a thing in the sequel. We should, at the very least, be introduced to the concepts used in the major dungeon equivalent in the sequel. And that brings me to the big boy: Divine Beasts, dungeons, temples, whatever floats your boat. One criticism traditionalists tend to have for Breath of the Wild that I think does make sense with the original game is that the Divine Beasts, and to circle back for a quick second, this applies to shrines too, to be fair, they're a bit too samey. But for me, it's not in the sense that they don't have the prototypical water temple or wind temple sort of feel to them, but instead that they don't double down on their own themes enough for fear that if they did, they couldn't be open-ended enough for Breath of the Wild's approach to gameplay. And in fairness, I'd agree with the assessment the designers landed on, given the fact that they only have but so much time and resources, so prioritizing is important, which is why ultimately, even though I agree that the shrines and by extension Divine Beasts feel tonally and visually samey, it's for the best because on a gameplay level, they are significantly more diverse because of that. That said, there is a solution to solve both problems, and that's to add on to an already well-established foundation. Parker has floated this idea, in part at least, and that would be magic. But to be more specific to the overall idea I want to talk about, just generally allowing for more ways to interface with the world for exploration, combat, and puzzles. This way, there can be shrines and dungeons that are more closely themed to their surroundings, while also allowing for multiple answers to the obstacles they present. In Breath of the Wild's current state, a heavily water-themed dungeon in Zora's Domain would likely funnel the player into using things like the Cryonis rune, ice arrows, maybe lightning arrows, and so on, and that doesn't really vibe well with the spirit of the game. But if they added the ability to manipulate things in more general ways, even if that means upgrading the stasis rune to apply more broadly to manipulate time overall, or adding complete new mechanics like magic, which would be enhanced by a playable Zelda, acting either as an AI controlled or preferably player controlled companion that could use their magic to assist in freestyling possible solutions to puzzles. Maybe that also means crafting and infusing that with its own chemistry engine quirks, like allowing players to make powerful creations like water infused electric arrows, or conversely allowing for players to experiment enough to create duds like fire infused ice arrows that would just fizzle out and evaporate into steam. A lot of players have been talking about how having the ability to use the original Breath of the Wild as a base allows for a quicker turnaround for the sequel, but I think the best thing about having this foundation is the ability to potentially take the same amount of time to add a lot of complementary additions to that foundation. And that yes, adding more solutions rather than changing the problem, i.e. instead of swapping out shrines and divine beasts for temples, keep the same concept Breath of the Wild introduced and just add more to it. Yes, and instead of no but. And with that in mind, I want to talk about expanding the world. Something I think fans do pretty much unanimously agree on is that the sequel to Breath of the Wild needs to expand on the depth of the world, both in terms of underground areas like the one we got a glimpse at in the reveal trailer for the sequel, but also underwater. Exploration to expand on the topography that already exists in a way that feels natural and believable. Maybe this comes by way of further upgrades made to the Zora or Goron suits, or maybe some sort of magical ability Zelda helps boy Zelda use and acquire. However they do it, it could be a great way to continue to add to the sequel without reverting to any of the long-held conventions of the Zelda franchise in any way. Sure, past Zelda games have taken Boy Zelda underwater, but never in a way that feels meaningful in the game overall, in the same way that while Skyward Sword literally takes place in the sky isn't used nearly as effectively as it is in Breath of the Wild. This should be something that, while yes, has some use in the Zora or Goron areas, should also be used elsewhere like most things were in the original Breath of the Wild. The suits and abilities from those respective areas being great examples of this exact idea. Like with Pokemon this year, I'm sure we'll have plenty more videos talking about all of this in more depth alongside the topical things that aren't directly related to Pokemon or Zelda, of course, but I just wanted to get out these ideas I've had during the early phases of Zelda's 35th anniversary before any announcements are made or anything like that, and in the early stages of my second playthrough of the original Breath of the Wild. But for now, those are my thoughts. What do you think the Breath of the Wild sequel can do to improve on the original without just cycling back to older ideas from the Zelda franchise? Or are you in the camp that thinks that the sequel and original Breath of the Wild, for that matter, should be more like traditional Zelda games? Let me know that and more in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you click the like button, and if you would like to see more from us, subscribe and ring the bell for more videos like it every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. New streams every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday over on our Twitch channel at 9 p.m. New podcasts over on our podcast channel at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Okay, that's it for me. See you next week.